When I think about a Range Rover, for some reason my mind immediately goes to a 1990s or an early 2000s Range Rover, dripping with leather and wood on the inside, off-roading through mud in Scotland somewhere. That is not the Range Rover that is next to me. This is a 2024 Range Rover Velar, because Range Rover is no longer a single model in the Land Rover lineup. Now it's an entire suite of vehicles, and that's why Range Rover is being spun off into its own brand. But back to that vision of a warm and homey English countryside interior, that is not what we find in the 2024 Velar, or honestly, most Range Rovers, because this is sleek, it's modern, it's minimalist, and to be honest, I would actually call it austere compared to its closest competitor in the US, which is actually the Porsche Macan, not a BMW or a Mercedes directly. The Range Rover lineup now has quite a span. On the bottom end of things, we have the Range Rover Evoque, and the Velar actually looks like a supersized Evoque to me from a lot of angles. We then have the Velar, then we have the Range Rover Sport, then we have the full-on Range Rover, then we have the stretched Range Rover, of course, at the very top of the lineup. The Velar is ostensibly a sportier model. This is the first model in the lineup that gets a rear-wheel drive-based drivetrain. The Evoque uses a transverse engine up front. This uses the new Ingenium inline 6, sending power to all four wheels, but with a strong focus on a rear power bias. But Range Rover says this is not ostensibly a sporty Range Rover, even though it is probably the sportiest of the bunch. That's because they wanted to give it a lot of off-road capability still. So you might want to take a look at the Velar if the Macan is a little bit too warm and homey on the inside, I guess you might say. It is weird to me that the British and the Germans have traded places here. The Germans used to be the ones creating very austere, very minimalist, very dark interiors, and now that is solidly the purvey of Range Rover with this Velar. But let's talk about the design up front first. We have a refresh for 2024, so we get new LED headlights with over 260 LEDs in each LED headlight there. We get a revised front grille and a revised lower bumper as well. The look is definitely very similar to the full-on Range Rover lineup, but you can see that everything has been minimalized and made a little bit sleeker. In this section of the grille, we have active air shutters to help improve the aerodynamics of the vehicle, and then down lower we have some additional cooling. As always, I'll take a deep dive into pricing at the end of the video, but at this moment you need to know that the Velar is more expensive than you might be thinking. The base price is $62,775, including destination. That is a whopping $14,000 more than a BMW X3. So this is not in the same price category as the X3 or GLC or Volvo XC60, especially when you're talking about the less expensive models. But this is right in the same price category as a Porsche Macan or a Maserati Grecale. In terms of style, this is definitely a blend of Range Rover Evoque and Range Rover Sport, but dimensionally it's closer to the Sport than the Evoque. It's 188.9 inches long, which puts this a whopping 18 inches longer than the Evoque and only 5 inches shorter than the Range Rover Sport. The Range Rover Sport has a hood just about as long because it was designed for the same engine family to live under the hood. The big difference happens in the back, where you find significantly more legroom in the Range Rover Sport and a little bit more cargo room behind. In terms of segmentation, this is a bit of a segment tweener because it slots almost exactly halfway between the X3 and the X5 in BMW's lineup, but its price tag, it's definitely very different because this is far more X5 than X3. The designers wanted to give the Velar a sleek and elongated look. One of the ways they did that was by lowering the roofline. That definitely gives this a very different vibe versus an X5 or a Range Rover Sport. If you park this next to a Sport, you'll notice it is notably taller and notably boxier than this. This definitely has a wide hip stance here with the wheel wells that flare out a bit towards the outside, and then we get these sleek redesigned tail lights that kind of mimic what we see in the larger Range Rover lineup. They are full LEDs and the turn signals are red, not amber. We also get a revised lower bumper where the exhaust tips are now tucked up under the bumper right there to improve the departure angle. That does end up giving the Velar a little bit of a pinched look in the rear, but they compensate for it a bit by giving it a very vertical rear end. You'll notice that the bumper really doesn't stick out more than the hatch. At the moment, the Velar is offered with two different drivetrains. They're called P250 and P400. P250 gets you a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo producing 247 horsepower. P400 gives you the 3-liter inline-6 turbocharged and supercharged engine delivering 395 horsepower, 405 pound-feet of torque, and it has a mild hybrid system added as well. Both engines send power to the ground via a standard ZF 8-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. You can lock the center coupling, but you cannot lock the rear differential. That is a feature reserved only for the more expensive Range Rover models. 0 to 60 times, according to Land Rover, are 7.1 seconds for the base engine and 23 miles per gallon, 5.2 seconds for this engine, but fuel economy obviously drops down to 21 miles per gallon. Over the week I've been driving this vehicle, I found the front seats to be pretty comfortable, but you should know they're not as adjustable as you might assume given the price tag. The passenger seat does have the same range of adjustment as the driver's seat, but neither one is going to give you an extending thigh cushion or inflatable bolsters or a four-way adjustable headrest or seat massage, features that you will find on competitive vehicles for roughly the same price. We do, however, have a power tilt telescopic memory-linked steering wheel connected to a 3-position seat memory over there on the driver's door. Jumping into the back, we have a little bit less room than you might assume given the exterior dimensions. With this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have a few inches left, so pretty comfortable there. But if I try and go over here to the right side, I do have to really work to get my feet in there. They actually can go in a footwell right under this passenger seat, but as you can see, I have almost no legroom left at all. Headroom, however, that is very generous, even given the lower roofline. Over here, I have maybe about 1.5 inches of headroom left, even though we have that large panoramic moonroof. And if I scoot over here to the middle, even though this is higher off the ground, I still have enough headroom to sit comfortably back here for an extended journey. You should know, however, that this center console and the driveline hump, they're pretty aggressive. Definitely takes up a lot of interior room. And for some reason, it flares out a bit towards the back of the seat, really making things a bit trickier. We have a 40-20-40 folding rear seat, and it does fold almost completely flat with the cargo area in the back. It actually is just a little bit lower than the cargo area, so if you were to drag a bag inside, it actually kind of drops down a little bit. When it comes to legroom figures, it's important to remember it is not simply a value from the firewall to the seat back in the rear. It's a calculated value following the contour of your leg. So if this had a roofline that was, say, 4 or 5 inches taller and the seating position was more upright, it could have more legroom than it does. Instead, the seating position in the Velar is a little bit more reclined, a little bit more relaxed than you'll find in a Range Rover or Range Rover Sport, and that's part of why the legroom figures are a little bit lower than you might think. The passenger compartment may be on the small side of things, but the cargo area certainly is not. We find 34.4 cubic feet of storage space behind this power hatch. That puts this actually ahead of the BMW X5 at 33.7. Fold down the rear seats, you have 70.1 cubic feet of storage space, which is almost exactly the same as that BMW X5. It only beats this by 2 cubic feet, despite the taller roofline. That's how big this is on the inside. It's just that Range Rover decided not to give you that space in the passenger area. Instead, we get it in the cargo compartment. This is significantly roomier in the back than a Porsche Macan. That will only give you 17 cubic feet, so about half of what we find in this model. The 40-20-40 folding rear seat back is also really cargo practical because you can fold down this center section independent of the outside sections and put those longer items right inside. As you'd expect out of an off-road oriented brand, we still have a spare tire in the Velar. This particular model has a temporary spare tire, but as you can see, a full-size spare would very clearly fit in the same wheel well. A spare tire is something that a lot of the European competition is eliminating, so I'm really glad to see Range Rover keeping it. Before we move on, I should talk about this odd design here. You'll notice that the load floor is pretty much level with the top part of this bumper, and the bumper actually kind of kicks up as it goes rearward. It has little drains in this slot so that way water doesn't accumulate, but you can bet that ice and snow and things like that, they will probably end up freezing in that little area. I don't quite understand why they designed it this way, other than maybe wanting the hatch to be a little bit shorter, and if that was part of the hatch rather than the bumper, the hatch would have to be about 1 inch taller. As we look around the interior, I should warn you that this is a very dark colored interior, so some of the details may get lost on the camera. This particular model has an MSRP of around $80,000. Up here we have the controls for the sunshade and the panoramic moonroof. That is as far as that front pane opens, but if I go ahead and close it back again, you can see that the first sheet of glass is actually really quite large. It goes to beyond the front passenger and driver's heads. I really like that touch there. But this roller powered shade that is going to come up here in a moment, It doesn't block all the light out. As you can see, it actually has a reasonable amount of transmission there, so it can make the interior feel a little bit hot in strong sunlight. We have fixed in-height shoulder belts for the driver and the front passenger, two-way adjustable headrests. You adjust them with that little button there, and then you'll find your choice of either leather or cloth upholstery in this model. If you get the cloth upholstery, it's a wool blend, which is kind of a nice touch. Down here you can see that we have moderate bolstering on the seat back cushions, not a lot of bolstering on the seat bottom cushions, so larger folks shouldn't have too much of a trouble with this particular seat design. Moving over to the front doors, we have lots of premium materials as you'd expect, but again, lots of very dark colors as well. The entire upper section of the door, that's made from soft touch materials, but there are actually two slightly different textures going on, which does intrigue me. So a bit more of a Naugahyde-like texture there, and then more of a smooth texture in that area. We then have real wood trim in the middle here, something that is disappearing in a lot of luxury vehicles. Thankfully, we still have it in this Land Rover model, but not quite as much wood in the Range Rover Velar as you might find in some of the competition. And we do find harder plastics, say, down around that bottom of the door there, that maybe you don't expect in a vehicle with an $80,000 price tag. Moving up to the dashboard, again, lots of soft touch materials in this entire upper section right there, but some piano black in the middle. I kind of wish that had been wood. Down here we find a bin-style glove compartment. I was barely able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Some of those larger ones likely would not fit in there. Well, we're talking about footwells. I should mention the shape of the footwell. You'll notice that over here we have a pretty substantial bump, but of course that would be the driver's side in right-hand drive countries, and oddly enough we find a larger bump over here for the driver in left-hand drive countries. I just think that may just be a priority of design thing when designing the vehicle. So keep in mind the footwell is certainly going to be more constrained and certainly tighter for a driver, especially if you have bigger feet. My size 11s do fit in here, but it always feels like either my foot is at kind of an odd outward angle or it's just a little bit too close to the brake pedal, so definitely keep that part in mind. Moving back to the middle of the dashboard, we find the biggest change. This is an 11.5-inch curved touchscreen LCD. It actually is curved in the vertical direction there, not horizontally across the dash. It definitely gives this a different look than we had before, where we found a two-screen setup in the dashboard. You can see the gentle curve right there. And they've gone in a very, very button minimalist direction with this system. The software, it's essentially the same as the full-on Range Rover. However, we don't have any buttons and knobs here. So we have basically the same home screen layout with these various widgets that you can scroll through. You can see we have wheel info there, driving style, etc. But then if you want to go into features like your climate control, you have to click on the screen. It then pulls up this climate control menu where you can adjust the temperature or adjust the heated and ventilated seats, and then there are further settings there. Also, this is where you'll find the buttons for the front and rear defroster and defogger there. Nav system obviously is going to be over there. It'll take you over to your Apple CarPlay device if it's connected. We have the same sort of controls over here for the passenger zone as well as a volume slider. So that's actually the volume slider right there. There's one on the steering wheel, but again, no physical buttons. It's a button for the 360-degree camera system there, and then some vehicle settings right in that screen. It also has this quick screen here so you can turn on and off the brake hold and auto start stop. Brake hold will remember that setting when you turn off the vehicle and turn it back on, but unfortunately the auto brake hold, or sorry, the auto start stop system won't do that. So it's always going to be doing that start stop. Below that we have more wood trim, a storage area with a Qi wireless charging mat right in there, and a USB-C charge point. Nice touches. This system supports wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto both. We then have the same sort of shifter that we found in the Range Rover Evoque. It's a joystick style palm shifter, so it's meant to kind of go right on your hand like that. There's actually a button right back there at the rear. That's how you unlock it. And then if I press that, we can go into drive, reverse, park is right there. We then have a split center armrest arrangement. They can go forward in this position where they cover the two cup holders. In there you can see the pretty typical Range Rover key. We've seen that from Land Rover for a while. It's basically the same as in all the other models. This section then opens up with these two sides independently to give us access to a storage area. You can see I have my smartphone in there connected via USB CarPlay. That is still an option if you'd rather do that. And you can slide these forward and backward independent of one another, but they don't ratchet into place. So there's no independent armrest like you'd find on the full-sized Range Rover. Over here on the driver's side, we of course have a full color heads-up display just over the instrument cluster. Then we have a full LCD instrument cluster underneath it. This is running the same software that we find in pretty much every Land Rover model. You have a bunch of different options as far as the screen layout and contents go. The basic designs are a single dial, you can go for a 2-dial, and you can also, if I go back into layout, go back there and get a map layout, I can get a full media layout. Keep in mind that the map layout is not going to give you satellite imagery like you might find in an Audi. There's also a media layout where it's going to pull information from your connected device, and then of course more of an automated safety systems layout as well. On the back of the steering wheel we have really great metal paddle shifters. I don't know if you can hear those clink, but they actually are a real metal paddle shifter. They have a really nice feel and a nice sound to them as well. Moving out from there, we find a very similar steering wheel to what we found before, because this particular sort of dished design has been around for a bit. We have touch controls on the left and on the right. They're a combination of physical and touch controls, so this entire button bank actually physically moves when you click it. You can see right like that. And then what it does is based on context. So you can see now I'm in a menu, so it actually has little lights that change there, and then you interact with that LCD instrument cluster right there with that side. Over on this side, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system, and you can see we have a stitched leather airbag cover in the middle of everything. Now, some of you might be wondering where the engine start-stop button is. It's right over here on the dashboard, just a little bit hidden by the steering wheel. That does take a bit of getting used to. Also, the adjustment for the powered tilt telescopic steering column, it's on the opposite side of the steering column from normal, of course, because this was originally designed for a right-hand drive country. Lots of stitched materials are going on pretty much everywhere. From this angle, you can definitely see the stitching work that's over here on the dashboard, and that continues all the way over to the other side of the dashboard around the window switches. Thankfully, they haven't gone all minimalist on that. We still have the usual complement of window switches and 3-position memory for the driver's seat. I would argue that the Range Rover Velar is the most dynamic Range Rover available. This has a quick 0 to 60, 5 seconds in the model as I'm testing right here. It is obviously going to be slower with the 2-liter turbo, but it's more than just the 0 to 60 time. It's the fact that this Velar has that strong rear power bias, something that you don't get in the Evoque, and it certainly feels smaller, tighter, and more nimble than the Range Rover Sport. Now, the Range Rover Sport is obviously going to be faster if you get the more powerful engine options, because you can get engines that are significantly more powerful in it, but it's not going to feel as nimble or as tight or just as small as the Velar, and that's a really good thing when we're talking about a winding road like this. As far as the 60 to 0 stopping distance, that's also on the short side, just 110 feet for the model as equipped here. This doesn't have terribly aggressive summer tires, so if you swapped in some of those yourself, you could probably get in below 100 feet. This model, however, does not have very aggressive brakes, so those repeated stopping distances, they're going to start stretching out a little bit, because it's not like we have big meaty Brembos or anything like that up front. This is the kind of vehicle, however, that really could handle, I think, the next level in performance from the Jaguar Land Rover envelope. I am kind of surprised that we don't see a high-performance Velar yet. When it comes to handling, I'm going to give this model a B. This is not an overtly performance-oriented trim. We don't have big, wide, grippy tires on it or anything like that, which are features that you will certainly find on the Porsche or the Maserati or the BMW and Mercedes competitors that are in this price point. This had a slightly different mission, and I think it's obvious. It's not that handling is bad, it's best described as very comfortable. It has that solid rear power bias, so when you want to play a little bit harder out on your favorite winding mountain road, it definitely starts turning into the corner really nicely like a rear-wheel drive vehicle does. But when you start to push it harder, you'll really notice that you get a lot of body roll, a lot of tip and dive, and it's just not as willing to turn around the corner as some of those more performance-oriented vehicles. Keep in mind, this is of course a Range Rover, so off-roading was definitely top of priority for this particular model's design. And that's what makes the Velar perhaps a little bit unusual, because it's also clear that this was designed to be very sporty, very style-forward, very livable, daily driver, useful, etc., but they didn't want to give up a lot of off-road capability, so they had to bake both of those things into here. And in some respects, off-road capability and on-road handling can be two ends of the teeter-totter. You do have to give up one to get the other. Out on a gravel road like the one that we're on here, the more off-road mission of the Velar is apparent. And that's part of the reason that this is not as dynamic as a Macan or a Grecale or something along those lines, because Range Rover really wanted this to be livable on rougher road surfaces. This is the kind of vehicle more aimed at my demographic. Someone that lives out in the country, has to go on roads like this on a regular basis. I live more than 2 miles down a road right like this one here. So for me, this would be a lot more comfortable on a daily basis, and I might be willing to give up a little bit of on-road performance, a little bit of dynamicism, in order to get the better ride quality that we get in the Velar. But obviously that's something that you're going to have to decide for yourself. Unlike the bigger Range Rovers, this one does not have an adaptive air suspension system, however. So you can't lift it up, you can't really change the ride quality quite as much as you can in something like the Range Rover Sport or the full-on Range Rover. But like the rest of the Range Rover lineup, we have the off-road drive modes, sand, mud ruts, gravel and snow, we have hill descent control, etc. All those are still available for you, just as they would be in the full-on Range Rover. This just doesn't have the next level of capability where we would find a full locker in the rear, for instance. This doesn't have an e-locker or anything like that in the back, and there's no low ratio mode. The vehicle can decide to lock the center coupling whenever it wants to, but that is not directly commandable by you as a user. In my cabin noise tests at 50 miles an hour, I measured 70.5 decibels in here, which did surprise me a bit because this is definitely louder than a BMW X5 out on the road. The X5 is particularly quiet, and remember that this is only $3,000 less expensive starting than the X5, and by the time we're talking about this specific model, it is well into the X5's pricing ladder. This model is about $80,000, and you could buy a reasonable number of X5s for that money. Fuel economy is also a little bit lower than I might have imagined. I've been averaging 21.5 mpg, which is slightly better than the EPA score, but still 21.5 miles per gallon for a vehicle that is smaller than an X5 and sleeker than an X5 is actually lower than many X5 trims. And there is no plug-in hybrid or full hybrid version of this available. The best way to think of this system is that it's sort of start-stop refined, start-stop improved. It's going to be able to stop the engine over a broader range of different situations, and it's going to be smoother when it does restart the engine. But it's not really going to have a huge impact on fuel economy outside of city fuel economy in moderate climates where it doesn't need to start the engine to run the air conditioning.
The Velar has quite a bit of competition in this segment. Let me just roll through this entire list, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some. We, of course, have the X3, the Macan, the F-Pace, the GLC, the Q5, the Stelvio, the NX, the XC60, RDX, Corsair, QX50, XT5, and that's not including the more coupe-like variants of those exact same entries. But the Velar is a little bit different. It's obviously more of a niche brand rather than a volume luxury brand like Mercedes or BMW, so the kind of shopper that's maybe shopping for something like a Velar is probably also looking at some of those more niche products like a Stelvio or the F-Pace or something along those lines. Speaking of F-Pace, the F-Pace and the Velar are very closely related, so you might really be cross-shopping these two against one another. So let's talk about that F-Pace first. The F-Pace starts a little bit less expensive, but the F-Pace is also theoretically not quite as off-road oriented. On the other hand, it has about the same amount of room as the Velar does inside because it's very much the same structure of vehicle, and it shares the majority of the drivetrains, but not all of them. And that's because you can still get the JLR 5-liter V8 in the Jaguar version. That will cost you a pretty penny though, because that will go up to $109,725. For some reason, Land Rover decided to cancel that model in the Range Rover Velar. It used to be available. It was called the SV Autobiography, but in the refresh that the Velar got recently, they decided to drop that engine, and so now you just have the two newer drivetrain designs. The F-Pace is the more on-road dynamic option, and to be honest, that surprised me, because I'd spent a reasonable amount of time in the F-Pace. This is the first time I'd spent any length of time in the Velar, and the difference was quite surprising. I ended up actually going to a Jaguar dealer and borrowing an F-Pace for about 30 minutes or so just to compare the two back to back after we shot the main portion of the video, and I don't think I was wrong. There is definitely a marked difference between the way the two behave on the road, and the F-Pace is much more my preference. You might also be cross-shopping something like a Porsche Macan with the Range Rover. I know for some folks that may seem a little odd since the Macan is definitely very on-road focused, but again, more of a niche brand, more of a low-volume brand here. The Macan also gets quite expensive, and actually a little bit more than the Jaguar. So if you thought $109,000 was expensive, hold on to your hats, because I stopped playing with the configurator when I got the Macan up to $120,400. The big thing with the Porsche here is customization ability. If you are willing to pay for it, you can get your Macan painted in all sorts of colors. Porsche offers a wide variety of paint customization options, and the options and features and accessory list is very, very extensive. I've only spent a little bit amount of time in this generation Macan, so hopefully stay tuned. We should have a full video coming up soon. But with a starting price of $62,550 going on up to that $120,000 price point, it is right in line with the Range Rover, especially when you consider that the top-end versions of Macan have no corollary in the Range Rover lineup right now. So very, very similar in terms of their pricing structure, but very different feel. You might also be thinking of something along the lines of a mainstream luxury option, is what I would describe the X3 as. Obviously, the X3 is a benchmark in this segment as well because they sell so many of them, but it is going to be less expensive, and that's probably the big takeaway here. $47,895, and that's part of why it sells so well. It's reasonably priced. It actually, I think, for the feature set that you get, is one of the more value-oriented options in this segment taken as a whole. Yes, there are going to be less expensive options from Acura, from perhaps Volvo, etc., but the BMW gives you the rear-wheel drive driving dynamics that a lot of people are after, inline-six engines, high-performance engine options as well, for relatively low pricing. And you'll really see that when you step up into the X3M. It stops at $89,495. So you could get an X3M for the price of a top-end Range Rover Velar. Obviously, they're not going to do the same sorts of things. The top-end Velar is going to be more off-road focused. You're going to be able to take it further off the beaten path. The X3 is going to get, really sticky summer tires, really low-profile tires, and they're going to be run flats because there's no spare tire. But it is very easy to live with, and I would say that the M340i is probably one of the best performance values in this segment. If you want a really good combination of decent pricing and high levels of performance, that would be fantastic. Now, how about something a little bit different and a little bit more off-roady? Because in the luxury segment, really, it's just the Land Rover and Range Rover line. The Lexus, the Acura, the BMW, the Mercedes, etc. None of these alternatives are very off-road focused. But a Jeep Grand Cherokee sure is. Here you might be thinking, hang on a minute, it's a Jeep, we're talking about a Range Rover, they're not the same sort of thing. And that is definitely true. The Grand Cherokee is larger. It's not as much larger, though, as you might think, because the Velar is actually a little bit on the long side for its segment. And yes, the Grand Cherokee starts a lot less expensive. It starts at $38,290. But if you get carried away with options, you can get it all the way up to $85,310. And that's because the Grand Cherokee has long been sort of America's Range Rover. A lot of the same capability, very similar off-road system design, very similar chassis design as well, because this is a unibody rear-wheel drive SUV. Now, some interesting things to know about the 2024 Grand Cherokee. We finally get some of the features we were promised, so hands-free driving along the lines of Cadillac's Super Cruise. We haven't been able to test that yet, mind you, but you can order it, and I've been told that they are actually delivering models with that feature on it. You'll also get some features you don't find in the average luxury car, like a night vision system. That's something that American car companies have been putting on vehicles for a while, and it hasn't received quite as much pickup from European car companies as you might think. On the downside, the V8 engine is dead. So the only engine options you have in the Grand Cherokee now are the 3.5-liter V6 and the 2-liter turbo plug-in hybrid system. The plug-in hybrid is actually kind of a novel option in this segment. It's not the most efficient hybrid system, but it will let you shift some of your consumption from gasoline to electricity, and you can really reduce your carbon footprint and spend less time at the gas station if you go that direction. The V6, it's not the peppiest engine. And I guess that's okay for the Grand Cherokee because the personality here is more big American luxury. It is nicely sprung, especially if you get the adaptive air suspension. It feels cushy, it feels soft. It's quiet on the inside. It definitely rolls in the corners, it tips, it dives with the air suspension, etc. But that air suspension is also going to jack up and give you over 11 inches of ground clearance. So if you want all of the dripping leather, the full leather dashboard, the leather-coated doors, etc., the high-end sound systems, the real wood trim, all the electronic doodads, and a second passenger screen in the dashboard, you can get all of that in the Grand Cherokee with a lot of off-road capability and a lot of off-road comfort as well. Reliability-wise, it's probably going to be a little bit better than the Range Rover or the Land Rover, but it's not going to be Lexus-like reliability, of course. Although, if you're shopping for something along the lines of a Stelvio or a Velar or a Grand Cherokee, something a bit off the beaten path, then that might not be the biggest deal to you. And yes, I realize the Grand Cherokee is the best-selling SUV in America right now in the mid-size segment, but the high-end versions, as far as a luxury cross shop, are a little bit off the beaten path. I don't know too many luxury shoppers that go in initially intending to buy a BMW or Mercedes and then end up at the Jeep dealer instead, although logically with these prices there is some cross-shopping going on. Let me know, what would your pick be if you were shopping in this segment? I have to say I would probably go with something like the F-Pace. I've always had a soft spot for it. I love the styling of the F-Pace. I love the spaciousness of it. And it drives better than the Velar, something I honestly hadn't quite expected. I kind of thought they would be a little bit more similar in terms of the way they drive on the road. But F-Pace over Velar would definitely be my pick. Let me know what your pick would be and which engine option would you choose. I think I would stick with the middle engine choice in the F-Pace, the top end choice in the Velar. The 5-liter V8 is a ton of fun and it sounds fantastic, but it is also very, very thirsty, and that's probably why Land Rover ditched it. Let me know. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the other social places, and I will see all of you next week.